Shall we boogie?
Yes, I think we can go ahead and get started. So thanks everyone for joining our third Polycon UK webinar. Today we have Dan Bernhardt from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign and Warwick, who is going to present the paper titled Demagogues and the Fragility of Democracy, which is joint work with Stefan Krasa and Mehdi Shadmehr. Before I hand over to Dan, just let me remind you as usual that we are holding this seminar every 2 weeks on Mondays at 3 p.m. UK time. So in 2 weeks, we will have Anya Noidor from the University of Glasgow. You can find more about our coming speakers on our website and on Twitter. So the format of the seminars is as follows. We have 50 minutes presentation with time for interim, qualifying, or questions that you can type in the chat, and then we can, the hosts are going to deal with, and we're going to cap 10 minutes at the end for additional discussions and questions. We request that everyone keeps their microphone muted and cameras turned off, but you can ask questions via the chat, and we will be fielding the questions for Dan. Great, and any remaining question we will address at the end. So this is all. Thank you, Dan. The floor is yours.
Okay. God invited us all to eat and drink, all we wanted. He smiled on our land, and we grew crops of plenty to eat and wear. God called, "Come to my feast." Rockefeller, Morgan, and their crowds stepped up and took enough for 120 million people and left only enough for 5 million of all the other 125 million to eat. And with so many millions must go hungry, and without those good things God gave us, unless we call on them to put some of them back. What was Huey Long's plan? Well, he wanted to impose a high progressive tax and distribute the revenue to every American family, $5,000 each, supposedly enough for a home, a car, and a radio. The radio was important because it was important for everyone to listen to his speeches. That wasn't it, though. Each family would be guaranteed an annual income of $2,500, plus shorter working hours, better veterans benefits, education subsidies, and pensions. The stuff of shoddy economic fantasy, but shiny 24-karat political populist gold. Fortunately or unfortunately, he got assassinated in 1935, but what was FDR's response to Huey Long in the middle of the Depression? Well, Long hopes to defeat the Democratic Party and put in a reactionary Republican. That would bring the country to such a state that by 1940, Long thinks he would be made dictator. There are, in fact, some Southerners looking that way and some progressives drifting that way. It is an ominous situation. So what did FDR do? Well, he mimicked Long's plan. He gave rise to the Second New Deal, Social Security Act, the Wagner Act, wealth tax. Soak the Rich Act was a direct response to save the system from crackpot ideas. FDR knew it was bad for the economy, but he was fighting populism in the form of Huey Long, Coughlinism, Townsendism. And so, he moved to forestall that threat. In practice, if you go back to the founding fathers of American, the Federalists, Washington, Madison, Hamilton, and so on, they all were concerned about the short-sighted nature of voters and the threats posed by demagogues. Madison's assumption about democracy was based on one about human beings. Man by nature invariably chose short-term over long-term interests. Voters had to have sufficient virtue and intelligence to select men of virtue and wisdom, or no theoretical checks, no form of government can render us secure. Livingston observed, Americans do not exhibit the virtue necessary to support a Republican government. Demagogues were men of sinister design who may, by intrigue, corruption, or other means first obtain the suffrages and then betray the interests of the people. So what do you want to take from this observation? Well, demagogues tell people what they want to hear. People focus on the short run. They can be tricked into focusing on the short-term gains at the expense of long-run costs, especially after hard times. So historically, if you look at the US, populists arose after the Great Depression, after the Great Recession. Jackson was the original populist, and he came on after the Panic of 1819. And similarly, populists arise in Europe after hard times. The populists are going to win unless the established parties that are interested in doing what's best for people adjust their platforms to compete appropriately with the demagogues. We're going to be modeling populism, and the central feature of populism, or a central feature of populism that we're going to be focusing on, is that the costs of populism are incurred in the future. In particular, demagogues on the left and right, both left-wing and right-wing populists, run down capital. They can be on either side of the political spectrum, but a key defining feature of populists is that they have massive budget imbalances. They tear down and destroy the legal institutions, the sort of mores and the social fabric that sort of binds society together. They tear things down. And this gives short-run gain and long-run pain. And this is a feature of Nazi Germany and the US, Poland, Hungary on the right, Zimbabwe and Venezuela on the left. So it's just, oops. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be putting these observations together and trying to make sense of the dynamics of the political competition that's induced by threats of populists. Okay. What are we going to be doing?
Dan, can I ask you, interrupt here? There's a question about the definition of populism here, because there are alternative definitions that refer to elitism. Is what your populism is different than demagogues?
Yeah, so I'm picking on particular features of populists as opposed to, so I guess, the picking on the elite is a form of tearing down institutions, if you want to think about it that way. But it's not a necessary feature of that we want to focus on. If you, our model is going to abstract from it. It's going to literally just focus on what I think is the common feature both of populists on the left and right. What saved Nazi Germany, after they had their huge budget imbalances, they invaded Austria, took all its gold, and rebalanced their budget. But we're picking off a central feature of populism. There are other features that we're not modeling. That's why in the paper, while I'm being a bit fast and loose between demagogue and populist, we use the phrase demagogue rather than populist, because we don't want the other baggage or the other notions that people have associated with populists. Does that help?
Thanks, yeah.
Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to have an infinite horizon economy, there's going to be a political competition between an idealist establishment, far-sighted, benevolent party that's going to want to maximize what it perceives as the social welfare of voters. And there's going to be political competition from a populist or demagogue party that only values holding office and doesn't really care about voters. And there's going to be a voter who's going to be short-sighted. For most of the talk, we're going to look at a completely myopic voter who only looks at the current consequences of policy platforms. All our results extend to allow for discounting. But we're going, so, this is going to give an advantage to a populist who doesn't care about policy platforms and can make a voter happy today on the policy front. But we're going to suppose that the demagogue is kind of at least stochastically going to be a shady kind of unsavory, unpleasant individual, which I think is a general characteristic of most demagogues. So the establishment party is going to have a stochastic valence advantage. And so it can propose policies that are somewhat more long-sighted and still have a reasonable chance of winning. So what are we going to do? We're going to ask, how does political competition from the populist party affect the policy choices of the benevolent party? When are you going to get good outcomes for society where the economy grows and grows despite the competition from a populist? And when are you going to get disaster like you see in Venezuela, Zimbabwe, or I would argue, give us 5 years in Russia, where you get a long-run death spiral with vanishing social capital. What's our model? Our model is going to feature two parties, a benevolent party and a demagogue. They're going to interact over time in an infinite horizon. The model is going to be very stark and simple. Each period, you're going to start out with a capital stock K. That capital stock is going to generate phi times K output. That output will be divided between investment in future capital and consumption. Capital evolves according, capital tomorrow is going to be rho times capital today plus investment, where one minus rho is the depreciation rate. So rho, so bigger rho says we don't need as much investment to keep the current capital stock up. And investment is going to be, we're going to divide investment. Investment is non-negative, and it's constrained by the output today of phi k. In our revision, we may be dropping the depreciation rate and allowing for short to reduce investment and make it so it can be negative, so they can dissave. The analysis is qualitatively identical. Each period, the parties are going to be proposing investments. Then there's going to be an election, and the winning party is going to implement its policy. How do voters decide? And in the formulation for today, we're going to assume that the voter is completely myopic. So it's going to care about the amount that the policy proposal from the candidates gives them for current consumption. And there's going to be an additive valence component. So the valence is just standard. It captures other fixed policy features, arguably. It can also capture just personal attributes unrelated to capital. We're going to normalize the benevolent party's valence to 0 and write VT rather than keep track of the demagogue. V is going to be distributed according to G, and the only structure that we're going to impose on the distribution of valence is that if the two candidates choose the same platform, then both have positive chances of winning. And our utility function that we're going to work with is going to be constant relative risk aversion. And when we're focusing on constant relative risk aversion, we're typically going to assume that the coefficient of relative risk aversion is bigger than 1, which is what macroeconomists tell us is the case. Parties are forward-looking. The benevolent party is going to be maximizing the expected utility of a representative voter. The demagogue only cares about winning, so it's going to get some payoff from winning, and it's going to maximize the expected sum of winning probabilities. The two technical assumptions that we're going to make, one is just a standard one that the growth rate in the economy is small enough that expected utilities are finite, but we're also going to assume that beta times phi is bigger than 1, so the benevolent party actually wants to invest. He wants a capital stock to grow. The timing is simple. The parties are going to propose policies, investment policies. Then there's going to be a valence shock realized. The median voter is going to select its preferred party, and then that party is going to implement its policy platform. We have a setting where the benevolent party only cares about policy, and the demagogue only cares about winning. And so we're going to make a refinement that rules out the possibility that the demagogue implements the benevolent party's preferred platform, and the benevolent party chooses a policy that would ensure that it would lose, because we don't think it makes sense in practice. So we're going to impose the assumption that the benevolent party weakly prefers its own policy that it proposes to the demagogues. That gives us uniqueness of equilibrium. What I'm going to first do is as an outline, I'm first going to do a benchmark with no demagogue. Then I'm going to go through log utility and competition from the demagogue. And then I'm going to go to constant relative risk aversion with coefficient of risk aversion greater than 1. So,
Dan, can I interrupt you before you go into details? The terminology you use, benevolent party, in a sense, in what sense are they benevolent if they have different preferences than the voters? So they are the only party who cares about the future. That makes them not now.
Right. So
Sorry.
I think, so I think that this is just, so if you go back, what we're capturing is benevolence in the sense that Madison and Hamilton observed, which is that they believe that voters are short-sighted and are predisposed to choosing policies that weigh current consumption. I think we can have a debate later, but I think tangibility about the future is really relevant in practice, and taxes today are very tangible. The consequences of a budget deficit are completely nebulous and intangible to me. I myself don't know the consequences of what current spending is going to do for the future. I think you know, if after the fact, you know, say if you were to ask, give a different context, if you were to ask Greek voters today, you know, did they think that pensions for, you know, retirement at age 50 was a good thing? And, you know, the spending at the rate that the Greek government did was a good thing. I think most of them would say no. And so, yes, we're modeling explicitly this form of myopia. The extreme myopia that we have isn't relevant for the for our analysis. Our results extend.
Thank you.
And yeah, okay. So what if we didn't have a demagogue? Then, you know, the benevolent party just faces no constraints in its maximization problem. It just wants to maximize the discounted lifetime utility of the voter, subject to the law of motion on capital, the investment, feasible investment, and you start out with some capital stock. There are minor technicalities. What we're going to do to solve this problem is we're going to prove that the value function is scalable, that it's multiplicatively separable in capital. And so capital is not going to affect the investments, the nature, the optimal investment is going to be to invest a constant fraction of the capital. So concretely, you know, if you, the planner's value function is going to be scalable. So the value of future capital, or the value of current capital, is just going to decompose multiplicatively separably into k to the relevant exponent of relative risk aversion times a constant. And so when we think about the optimization problem, what is that going to mean? It's going to mean that K factors out of the optimization problem, and the solution is going to just be what share of capital should we consume today, and what share lambda should we invest tomorrow. And what's the solution? Well, the solution, you just differentiate and solve, and you want to recognize that beta times phi is bigger than 1 by assumption. That's just saying the return on investment is positive, and so this is going to be bigger than 1. And so another way, what does that mean? If you bring rho over to the other side, you see that rho plus lambda is bigger than 1. And so if there's no competition from the populist, we're going to be eventually in the land of honey and heaven, you know, where capital grows forever and ever, and everybody's happy. The comparative statics are sort of the natural ones. They're increasing in the productivity, or when voters are more patient. And when depreciation is smaller, you say you don't invest as much because you get the same capital with less investment. So you're willing to consume. You want to consume more today. How does this change when we introduce a threat from the presence of a demagogue? Well, so what does political competition do to the policies that the benevolent party selects? we're first going to look at log utility. Log utility is going to turn out to be a convenient assumption because the property that the value function is scalable is going to be preserved. And so we can characterize the optimum, again, using first order conditions. So we're first going to look at a demagogue that only cares about winning in the current period. So he's going to offer the policy that's going to maximize the voters' current period payoff. So he's going to propose to save nothing or invest nothing. The same exact results hold when the demagogue is far-sighted and forward-looking, and I'll actually prove that. I say it's in the paper, but we'll actually prove it here. When is the voter going to elect a benevolent party? Well, he's going to compare the utility of the policy that the benevolent party, from consumption, given the investment proposed by the benevolent party, with the utility associated with the platform of the demagogue. The demagogue's going to propose to invest nothing. And then there's this additive valence shock that we've put on the right-hand side for the demagogue. So if I just subtract if I just bring the policy payoffs to the left-hand side, we're going to see that the demagogue is going to win whenever the utility whenever his savings policy doesn't propose to save so much that that the negative valence shock of the V is going to be typically a negative number. He doesn't choose such an unpalatable policy that it suffices. He still beats the demagogue. V is distributed according to G, and so the benevolent party is going to win with probability G of D. So why is log utility easier to analyze anyway? It's not trivial. Well, the key feature is that its value function is still scalable in capital. And why does that obtain? Well, you can just look here and you can see that, if I multiply capital and investment by some constant, they cancel out of D. And so the level of capital is not going to affect how voters view the difference in the policies proposed by the demagogue and benevolent party. And, so G of D is also not going to hinge on the capital stock. And so we're going to get an optimization problem for the benevolent party that is not going to depend on the capital stock. And that's going to mean, again, that the benevolent party is going to choose to save a constant fraction of the current capital stock. What is the benevolent party's optimization problem? Well, he's going to choose the fraction that maximizes what? Well, it wins with probability G. As it promises to save more, it's less and less likely to win. But when it wins, they get to smooth consumption intertemporally. So they're saving a share lambda, and tomorrow they're getting additional capital associated with that. So this is probability the demagogue wins times the benevolent party wins times the payoff when it wins. And then with residual probability, 1 minus G, the demagogue's going to win. He's going to save nothing. Capital stock is going to depreciate and be smaller next period. So what do? You just differentiate with respect to lambda and solve. What are the features? Well, not surprisingly, as a basic observation, political competition from the demagogue is going to reduce equilibrium investment relative to the when there's no demagogue present. So with log utility, the planner's problem is linear. It's decreasing in rho. With a demagogue, you're going to save less. Why is that? Well, at lambda p, at the no competition optimum, the marginal benefit from higher investment, which is the improved smoothing of consumption over time, basically, is going to be 0. But now at lambda p, the marginal cost of increasing investment is going to be strictly positive. What is that marginal cost? Well, as you increase investment, you reduce D, the difference in utility derived from the policies. So now the benevolent party is more likely to lose. And when it loses, the benevolent party's policy is not implemented, it is the demagogues. So the cost is the lowered payoff from from losing rather than winning. What that result that I just said was a simple result. It just said the benevolent party is going to scale back investment, but there's a much starker result that obtains when the depreciation rate is high. So in particular, when depreciation becomes almost complete, then the share of capital reinvested that the benevolent party proposes to reinvest goes to 0. Lambda goes to 0. In contrast, without political competition, it would go to you save the constant fraction beta. What accounts for this is that, well, when depreciation is high, the cost of losing to the demagogue is high, because when he wins, 98% of capital gets wiped out because he doesn't invest anything. And so the benevolent party is very worried about losing. And so it scales back investment in order to minimize that risk of losing. Indeed, one manifestation of this is when we look at rho in the neighborhood of 0 and we increase rho a little bit, then we see that it's optimal to increase savings. So in the neighborhood of 0, the threat of losing is so high. If you think about the log utility of 0 is minus infinity. So utility is plunging off the face of the earth as capital goes to 0. And to prevent that possibility, the benevolent party is savings is going to 0. Now, as rho increases, you're a little bit less concerned about losing, and so you respond by actually increasing the amount that you save. So it's going in exactly the opposite direction of what investment would be without political competition. Let me just illustrate that. Okay, so here, if you look at this picture, what I'm plotting is a setting where I'm giving the benevolent party a 2 standard deviation advantage. So the valence distribution is normally distributed. So if the two parties offered the same political platform, the benevolent party would win 98% of the time. And now what I'm doing is I'm plotting what this savings rate is as a function of as a function of rho, so 1 minus the depreciation rate. So here is the social planner's solution. So we see as rho goes up, he saves less and less if there's no political competition. Here we see, here's the result analytically that we established that in the neighborhood of 0, the benevolent party, as rho increases, he saves more. But we see here that even with a 2 standard deviation advantage, it's not so big that as rho gets large, lambda starts to mimic the social optimum. Even as rho gets to 1, there's roughly speaking, they're cutting investment by 50% vis-a-vis a setting with no demagogue, and it's monotone increasing throughout. If we were to give the benevolent party a 4 standard deviation advantage, then this would start to look more like, as rho got high, it would look more like the social optimum. And that's just because the probability of losing is so low that, when rho goes up, the costs of losing aren't so high, and so you're more willing to do what would be socially optimal in the absence of competition. One of the corollaries of this result is that if depreciation is high enough, then since savings since lambda gets small, since savings get small, it's not going, when rho is small enough, the depreciation is going to be high enough that the amount that's saved is going to fail to cover the lost, the depreciation. So even when the benevolent party wins, the capital stock is going to shrink, and in the long run, it's going to go to 0 almost surely. Concretely, if you want to put it in what does it mean in terms of when is it going to go to, when is there going to be a death spiral with capital converging to 0 in the long run? When is there, there's going to be a death spiral when rho plus lambda to the g, the probability of winning, given the policy lambda chart, times rho to exponentiated at 1 minus g is less than 1. Where does that come from? What does the evolution of capital look like? Well, the evolution of capital after U wins by the benevolent party and T minus U wins by the demagogue, what's it going to be? Well, it's just U wins by the demagogue, you're going to be rho plus lambda to the U, it's going to grow U times, and it's going to shrink with, according to depreciation, T minus U times. Just rewriting this and applying the law of large numbers, U over T is going to go to G in the long run as T goes to infinity. Rho to the 1 minus U over T is going to go to the 1 minus G. So if this expression is less than 1, when you exponentiate it to T and let T grow very large, it's going to be going to 0 with probability going to 1. Okay. What does that mean in terms of numerically? When are you going to see a death spiral? So here I'm plotting, again, with normally distributed valence shocks. Here is the, here are different values of mu, which capture the benevolent party's valence advantage. And here's the cutoff below which, when depreciation is higher, or when the savings rate rho is lower, you're going to have a death spiral. And what you want to observe is that when the benevolent party valence advantage is small, you're very likely to have a death spiral. How is this affected by, I made the claim at 10 minutes ago or 15 minutes ago that the same outcomes emerge with a far-sighted populist. Okay. Why is that? Well, claim the unique linear Markov perfect equilibrium corresponds to the myopic demagogue equilibrium. Why is that? Well, it's just saying that the demagogue is still going to choose the policy that's going to make the voter happiest now. It's still going to invest nothing, okay? Why is that? Well, if the benevolent party adopts a linear strategy, well, then the demagogue's probability of winning is not going to depend on the capital stock, because it's just going to disappear from the policy comparison. It's going to cancel out. So the demagogue's value function isn't going to hinge on the capital stock. So if future payoffs aren't going to be affected by the capital stock, then the demagogue does best to maximize its probability of winning today, and it does that by choosing those savings. Okay, let's now look at the real world, the more relevant real world scenario, where we think that in practice voters or consumers are more risk averse than log. And in particular, macroeconomists tell us that the coefficient of relative risk aversion exceeds 2. How does that, what complications does that have? Well, now, if you think about what happens? Now, the problem, the technical problem that you run into is that the populist policy advantage falls as capital stocks grow large. So if you, for example, if you see, and why is that? Well, you can see that here's the policy advantage with when the coefficient of relative risk aversion is 2. And you can see that K shows up in the numerator or denominator, so that as capital stocks get large, the difference in policies proposed by the candidates gets weighed by a smaller number. And so this means that as capital stocks get very, very high, valence is going to become the primary determinant of who wins rather than the policy choices. In contrast, when capital stocks go very low, policy differences are going to become the primary difference, the decider of who wins. So that captures both the economics as capital stocks get large, the benevolent party is going to be advantaged when capital in terms of policy and do well. When capital stocks are small, the demagogue has a significant advantage because policy differences drive voting to a large extent. But it also means that analyzing the optimal investment policy is hard, because it's not going to be a simple linear. The optimal policies are not going to be save a constant fraction of capital. we want to be able to characterize equilibrium outcomes, and we're going to be able to do this when capital stocks are small, and we're going to be able to do this when capital stocks are large, basically reflecting that, when capital stocks are small, policy differences are going to drive outcomes, and when capital stocks are large, the primary determinant is going to be valence. So the key is when capital stocks are small, is we're going to identify a lower bound on the sensitivity of the benevolent party's value of marginal value of capital in the future. And so this is going to let us bound the optimal investment policy away from zero. And then we're going to prove that if capital stocks go to zero, then regardless of the rate of depreciation, savings are going to go to zero. The benevolent party is going to propose to save almost nothing, but it will propose to save something. So it'll propose enough to have some it'll propose enough that it reduces its probability of winning. It will not choose exactly the same platform as the demagogue. Okay.
And,
yeah.
You have about 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. Let me try. Let me just. So I'm actually going to skip this. The technical stuff. What we do is we bound the derivative of the value function for the benevolent party, and what that's going to do is we now can think about differentiating this with respect to lambda. The marginal cost is going to be, well, if you increase probability of losing when you have some positive investment times the difference in utility from the two platforms. But if lambda is equal to zero, then this utility difference goes to zero. So the marginal cost goes to zero at lambda equal to zero. The marginal benefit is always strictly positive because we can substitute in a lower bound for the marginal benefit of increased capital. Okay, that's the logic. So why then does, when capital get small, we save almost nothing? Well, if it were bounded away from zero when capital stock gets large, then the difference in policy is going to be goosed up arbitrarily high. And so the benevolent party would always lose with probability 1, but then losing is, ensures that there's no investment, which is suboptimal. Okay. So bad times are going to bring out populist policy. What does that mean? Well, the corollary is that once capital gets below some cutoff, a death spiral becomes inevitable. But what does that mean in turn? Well, the probability of losing is always positive because no matter what even if the benevolent party mimics the demagogue can still win with positive probability. And so that means there's always a chance, no matter what current capital is, that the demagogue can win a bunch of times and bring the capital stock down. So it's kind of, if the capital stock falls below a threshold, then even when the benevolent party wins, he doesn't save enough to offset the depreciation, and the capital stock is going to continue to shrink. So it's like a black hole. You get sucked. The economy is a few bad draws of having the demagogue win a few times, depreciating capital, and bad times go on. And moreover, there's a win-win feature for the demagogue of not investing because it maximizes the probability of winning in the future period, in the current period, but it also reduces the capital stock, which magnifies the consequences of the policy differences in the future. Okay, so populist trap, let me skip that. What about investment when we've been able to grow capital stock? Well, if capital stock is large, then the benevolent party is going to save more than would a social planner who is unconstrained. Why? Because he wants to insure against the possibility of losing to the demagogue, okay? Because he's scared of the possibility that the demagogue's going to win, and in which case capital stocks are going to depreciate and he's going to face an increased risk of losing election. Let me skip the proof, oops. So what have we shown? We've shown that the probability of a death spiral is bounded away from zero. If capital ever falls below a certain level, it's going to fall thereafter, but it's not completely bad news. If you reach a high enough capital stock, then there's always a positive probability that capital is never going to fall below that level. Okay, that is, death spirals are not inevitable. Okay, and what's the intuition for this argument? I'll just take 2 more minutes. If capital stock is high, then if the benevolent party wins enough times in a row, then it can offset the one time of having a demagogue. So you had Obama, you had some other guys before Obama. Now you draw Trump. Trump drives down the capital stock, but the previous guys built that capital stock enough up so that that you're still okay. So what's going to happen is, if you can think of it as a the benevolent part, when capital is high, the benevolent party is going to win with a probability close to G of 0. And if G of 0 to the J is bigger than a half, then if you think about a random walk starting at 1, it's a biased random walk. It's more likely to transit up than down. And so that means that the probability of going down is bounded from below by this, and the probability of staying above is strictly positive. Okay, so again, what's it saying? Well, if you're lucky enough at the outset to draw Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, and so on, you can build up enough capital to offset rare draws of a bad demagogue, but conversely, a few demagogues near the outset can doom society forever. And let me just stop there. Questions?
We had a few comments and questions in the chat. I think one question that I want to ask is from Kirill, who I think had to go. His question was, what's the right benchmark? Your benchmark is no competition whatsoever, but shouldn't this be 2 competing benevolent parties, but with a different, perhaps?
So I think that the right way to think about the benevolent party, and if I had had more time, I would have said it at the outset, is to think of it as it comes from the competition of 2 benevolent parties at first, or multiple benevolent parties. In this setting, the voter would be choosing between the best of the benevolent parties and the demagogue. So the benevolent parties, because they only care about maximizing the welfare of the voter, they're going to choose the same policy, and then the one with the highest valence would win. You could think of this as being a source of the benevolent party's valence advantage in part, arguably. So I think of it as there being competition in the background between benevolent parties, but there's also a populist.
but the investment would be, how would the investment be different if there were just two benevolent parties with different balances?
Oh, the investments would be the same. The economy would grow forever. I don't view candidates like Trump as benevolent.
Other questions? Do we have any raised hands or any other questions?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Just before you introduced this very last ray of hope, I was about to make a point that it seemed like there was, we're doomed to destruction because we all find a demagogue sooner or later. But so before I saw this result, I was thinking what other assumptions or what other things could make this death spiral not so inevitable. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is that maybe opportunities for depredation or for lack of investment decrease as the economy decreases. So in some sense, voters might be myopic and so on. I mean, your model is super stylized, but at some point that you might, again, in a stylized way, want to think about there is a limit to which you can stop lack of investment once the stock of capital goes below a certain level. I mean, if, even in the Great Depression or the worst depressions that we've seen in, for any realistic example you want to come up with, there is a limit at which point people start saying, well, maybe this has gone far enough. The depredation has gone far enough. We ought to go back to something that works differently. I mean, people can observe the outcomes and can see that this doesn't work eventually, right?
So I would say two things. One is if you look at Venezuela, I'd say, their capital stocks are getting pretty close to zero. But there's
another story, which is that the demagogue then doesn't make it democratic anymore, right? So
arguably, but Zimbabwe, so that would just reinforce the downward plunge. But the other feature is that you're correct. I would have put it in a different way. We don't have voters learning from experience. So I think that, in fact, an interesting problem quite generally in this setting is the learning that goes on. So if you were to look, I mentioned Greece at the outset. I think that for a long time, deficits weren't tangible. They couldn't see the consequence of increased deficits. So for a long, long period of time, in some sense, the demagogues, as it were, if you want to call them demagogues, were able to conceal the consequences of weighting current consumption at the expense of the future. But eventually, they couldn't keep concealing it, and it became clear. In fact, I would argue that, in a lot of countries, it was that tangibility of the bad consequences of excessive spending and not enough of bad fiscal policy, as it were. It was the observability that changed policy. So if you were to look at Canada or Australia or Ireland, at some point the consequences became apparent to voters, and they no longer tolerated excessive spending. So one of the reasons I started out at Queen's University in Canada, and that one of the consequences of that excessive spending was the premier introduced Ray Days, where we got unpaid holidays as a professor, but which we could take any day we wanted, except if it were a teaching day. So you give us 10 days of unpaid holidays, lots of people left. And, so I think that there is important research to be done in terms of the learning by voters about things that are tangible. Another way of saying it is, one of the things that political economy assumes, or political economists invariably assume, is that the policies themselves that candidates propose are understood by voters, that they're tangible. And in fact, they're not. If you think about assessing healthcare plans, prior to Obamacare being implemented, people didn't know what it meant. And one of the reasons that, so it could be demonized. One of the reasons that it's hard to get rid of Obamacare now, and it's hugely unpopular, is because its effects have become tangible. And that's true with an awful lot of policies that are out there, that voters learn when things become tangible. One of the things that's not tangible is debts and deficits until you can't borrow anymore.
Okay, great. Great. So thanks, Dan, and thanks everyone for tuning in. So the official time of the seminar is officially concluded, but we are going to keep the meeting open if you want to stay around and ask Dan a question, because I see there's a couple of additional questions that we're not going to have time to ask for everyone. But if you want to stay around, feel free to do so, and we'll be happy to hear your questions. So thanks everyone for connecting, and we will see you next week. So in 2 weeks' time with Anja Neundorf. Thanks. Bye. Great.
Now
So,
I can see you guys again.
Yes. So Francesco, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi Dan, how are you? Great to see you. How's the weather in Illinois?
The weather's fine. I'm about to have my hip chopped off in 2 weeks, but otherwise.
Yeah, no, that I've seen it on Facebook. Yeah. Best wishes. I don't know the literature on populism. I mean, it seems to me that the common feature is this idea that because the populist upholds the will of the people, it identifies enemies of the people. That could be the elites, but they could be some foreign power, or even globalization, or I don't know, the European Union in the case of European states. And I mean, this is part of this idea of tangibility and the rhetoric of what causes what that could be built into your model, because you could say, okay, I mean, instead of being the effect of poor policy decisions in terms of saving, current bad times are caused by these enemies of the people. And that is, that would go against the objection that the other Francesco raised. But also important, I mean, do you know if this feature of populism has been studied? Is there literature on this, or?
There's very little theoretical work on populism. You have a paper by Asimoglu and Sonnen, I think somebody else. It's just a simple signaling static signaling paper, where they take where the populists are on the left and they signal that they are not corrupt by taking positions that would be costly for a corrupt candidate. And but that's it. And I would also say that model does not quite match reality, that populists tend to be more corrupt concretely.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. So we also had another question from Clement. Clement, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was wondering if in a lot of cases we can think of the investment as protecting you a bit from demagogues. So if you think about investing in education or freer media this sort of thing. So I understand that, and in this case, I would reduce the voters' myopia over time and sort of push you away from the death spiral or that lower bound, the threshold to where the capital needs to drop. So obviously, I understand it would be hard to, in the stylized model, to introduce to relax the voters' myopia, but you could even think of shifting the distribution of the valence shock in favor of the benevolent politician over as a function of investment they make. And in this way, if you invest enough, you avoid falling below the threshold of capital.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about what would happen if if you were to be able to alter somehow the distribution of valence. Yes, it might be, or you could think of it as, as you put it, investment in something that better helps the voter distinguish features of the populace versus others that we can model on the as a function of valence rather than the capital stock. It's an interesting thing to think about. I don't really know how it would alter the economy.
Okay, thanks.
I think probably qualitatively what it would do is it's more likely to be able to set an economy up so that it has more long-run stability. So that if capital stocks get large, it's more likely to be able to offset a draw of a populist. I could model that. It would be interesting to model.
Okay. Are there any additional questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Francesco Squintani might have another question. Or was it still the hand being raised?
Oh, I'm sorry. No,
From before.
Okay.
I have a question, if that's okay. It's about the repeated game type of question. So in your model that you presented, the demagogue was short-sighted. So that was very easy from the game theory point of view because they had a dominant strategy, and the only concern that the only issue that we're investigating was the benevolent party. But with the far-sighted demagogue, that would be a more complicated game that would have multiplicity of equilibria. Is that?
Okay, yeah, so that's an interesting question. And actually the paper has an interesting result on that. So I'll say a few things. So with log utility, the unique linear Markov equilibrium is the one that we describe, even if the guy is, and I gave you sketched out the proof. It's also the unique equilibrium of the stationary limit of the finite horizon economy. So if you think about how does that work, in the terminal period, they're not going to invest. And so the probability of winning isn't going to depend on in the last period, isn't going to depend on the capital stock or and so they're going, so in the next to last period, that means that, if the choice in the next to last period isn't going to help you in the last period, you're going to maximize the probability of winning in the next to last period, and it's going to unwind like that. The next observation is you can ask, suppose that it's obvious that, trigger strategies can support better equilibrium outcomes. So concretely, you could imagine the following, and we do this in the paper. You could imagine basically having a threat where what happens is the benevolent party increases its savings above what it does in the linear Markov equilibrium. and the demagogue increases its savings, but in such a way which is good from the benevolent party standpoint, but in such a way that the demagogue is more likely to win. And then we support it by threats to revert to the linear Markov equilibrium if somebody defects from that. Now
but that's just one equilibrium. So
that's one. Yeah. No. So I want to make a point. With the point that I want to make is you cannot even as discount factors get large, you cannot support the unconstrained optimum. So another way of saying it is that you do not get the standard, we can do wonderful things as beta goes to 1. And why is that? Well, if you're going to be supporting wonderful things, then the demagogue's policy has to be close to the optimum. But now here's where the refinement that the benevolent party has to weakly prefer its policy platform to the demagogues kicks in. So that's going to mean that its policy has to be close to the optimum. But then if the two policies are close, the demagogue's not going to be so likely to win because it's at a valence disadvantage. And so it would actually strictly want to defect to save nothing. So it's kind of a cool result.
Just have an offshot question that was related to that. So some systems differ, how easy it is to establish a new party. So in some countries you have those two incumbents that are always, Democrats and Republicans, and in some countries, maybe with proportional system, it's much easier, and pretty much every new season there's a new offspring. So that suggests that it's easier to form a demagogue, even if there is a far-sighted demagogue, a new one that is short-sighted could come along. And is there anything else about any insight about kind of entry decision here?
Oh gosh.
Because it seems to me that the demagogue, one of the features of a demagogue is that very often these are just startups.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting observation. And it also, or another way of saying it, I think, is that those parties are often oriented around a single person. And that person is a startup almost by construction. Yeah, I mean, that I don't know how to model it, but I think, that it's also why in practice, I think that these demagogues are short-sighted, or haven't, I didn't say that right. Even if they, in practice, they behave to maximize probabilities of winning office. And someone like Trump, literally, it's quite clear that he does not care about policy per se. I mean, if you think about, testing, wanting to, for COVID, wanting to cut back on testing to reduce the number of positive discoveries. There's just, if you cared epsilon about voters, you would not do this. This is solely about stage performance and winning re-election. Now, maybe Trump is a bad example for a demagogue, because I think most demagogues actually have policy preferences of some form. But
can I say something about two things that were just raised? One is, it's actually true that, but look at the Republican Party. You could argue that the Republican Party, because of the Tea Party and so on, got into a demagogical spiral in the last 10, 15 years. I mean, the polarization in the United States is much larger than before. I'm not sure the Democratic Party has changed very much. terms of policy preferences, but certainly the Republicans have. And we can see it here too with the Tories, which have become significantly more pro-Brexit in the last 10 years than they were before. I think for the Tories, there was this threat from this UK Independence Party, but in the United States, the Tea Party movement, basically the demagogues took over one of the two mainstream parties.
Yeah,
Another
I think.
thing I want to maybe, sorry, just to finish, Francesco mentioned one of the things that might be interesting to think about is, if I think of my own country in Italy, things have been going bad for a long time. And so what I think demagogues in Italy tend to do is they start picking somebody else to blame. I mean, there is really a lot of things that can go wrong before you get caught out, because even if things are not going well internally, you can just blame somebody else. So there's also that aspect. So the enemy aspect is always an important aspect. I mean, the Argentinians did the Falkland invasion because of, the dictatorship was in trouble politically. And so they, if in doubt, start a war. That's going to make people feel better about you, whatever.
Yeah, so I would say three things. Let me reverse. So I think the point about enemy, I agree. And I think that can motivate why it takes longer to discover. And so phrased differently, the consequences, why our formulation of the model is is a good one. So I think that it actually captures that feature well, and that's a nice point for me to think about. I would say in the U.S., I think what happened is partly it's the primary structure that and gerrymandering that drove it. And so it became very easy for populists. A Republican was going to win any congressional seat in Alabama. And so now, that just drifted left or drifted right. I think that one of the consequences of Trump may end up being that there's a new party coming in. And I think, that the U.S. historically has a two-party system for a variety, just from the nature of the competition. But there are these, various periods in time when events like the Depression and the 1830s combined with slavery that led to a reorganization of parties. So I think that we may well be seeing that happening in the next 15 years in the US. For what it's worth. We can always hope.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions? Okay, so it seems like we're almost done, so we're gonna conclude the meeting in a sec.
Thank you, Dan.
Very neat.
Okay. Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you. Very interesting.